So this is sort of a random message that God gave me to do. Um, and it's not normally within my kind of wheelhouse. Like, I'm not really an evangelist. It's not really, I understand, like, the old idea is that everybody is called to be an evangelist to some extent. I get it. My calling has always been mainly to the church, and that has been verified again and again and again. Um, it's not that I don't have a heart for the lost or anything. It's just it's not really where I feel called. You know. So God gave me this message, and I always knew that we were going to kind of do it because it was during the last message that I gave, that I shared, which was out of the Advent of Light message. You know that this message was an invitation for people to come into the presence of God. And it was engineered towards the church. However, during the time period when I was like receiving different words and so on about it, and if you're not a Christian and you're like listening to this, just bear with me for a moment. We'll get to what this is about. Um. Anyway, so when I was like praying about it, there were a few things that God led me to, messages and different things posted on YouTube and different places like that by atheists and people of other religions, talking about the struggle of developing a relationship with God. And it wasn't just like people of other religions. There were even some Christians in there too, where they were like, they're very cessationist, or they're very legalistic in their approach. Even my YouTube is currently flooded with Orthodox Christian stuff, and I don't know why, but I just presume it's a God thing. You know, and here's the thing: I was kind of like wondering why it didn't come up because I was there. Also, if you're hearing like voices in the background, forgive me. That would be from the wife. She's playing. She plays messages, sermons while she's asleep, and she got one of the particularly yelly ones. So, yay! That I tested out the mic beforehand. I knew it was going to pick it up, but God said do the thing, so I'm doing the thing. um, anyway, but there were a lot of questions. There were a lot of things about this, and as I was prepping for that message, I heard all this stuff. Like, it was all stuff that God gave me to talk about. But when it came time for the message, the Holy Spirit started flowing, and it didn't come up, and I wondered why. And I heard that I was probably going to have to sit down and do an additional something. Um, and here we are. I was on the way home from. I went and played a card tournament at work. We were all playing Flesh and Blood for a 5-hour, 5-round event, and it was actually a lot of fun. But on the way home, I was just listening to a message, and God was telling me, "Here's what you're going to do." So here we are. So just to kind of like try to keep this a little bit more short, especially since it is like 5 o'clock in the morning or something like that. When I'm recording, uh, let's just go into it. The Advent of Light message is effectively a opportunity for people who believe in Jesus to kind of come into the presence of God. But what about people who don't? What about people who are looking? What about people who have relationships with other things? This message, you'll see the title is The Invitation, because that's what this is. This is an opportunity. I need to talk to you first a little bit before we go there, because this is what he gave this to me for, was for people who are atheists, who are cessationists, who are who do stand outside of the presence of God. And I know that, like, maybe you're not, maybe you do believe in God. Maybe you claim Christianity, but maybe the idea of having a relationship with God is something obscure or esoteric, or it seems fake. The thing about it is that so many Christians, they read the Bible and they read stories about Moses, talking to God directly. They read stories about Jonah talking to God directly. You read all the books of the prophets, and these men are all speaking the words of God. Abraham talked to God. Jesus claimed. Jesus' big thing was, I only do what my Father tells me to do. He heard from God all the time. He was talking to God all the time. And it wasn't just prayer. Okay, like, I know that, like, there are some faiths of Christianity who try to say that Jesus was receiving all that he was receiving for prayer, or they try to say things like, well, he only had all that because he was Jesus. He was the Son of God. Well, explain Moses. Explain Peter. Explain Paul. They all did this too. So what it all boils down to is that there's this opportunity for us, all of us, to draw close to God in such a way as to actually have a deep, connected relationship with him that is very, very real. And if you think for a moment that it's like something that's not covered in the Bible, it's John 17 is Jesus literally praying for us to understand the interconnectedness that we're meant to have between him and the Father and us. He even gives a special prayer for those who come after the disciples, who will not have the direct contact with him that they did, but for them to have the same understanding, for us to have that same understanding. And therein is our thing. Like, if you believe in the Bible, then these are stories, these are things that you claim to believe in. You might even, like, say that this is the inerrable word of God, right? So why don't you believe in any of it? Why don't you believe in the things where you're literally being shown what a relationship with God looks like? Why do you think it's all relegated to a book? Jesus quotes scriptures. Paul quotes scriptures. Paul was a Pharisee. He knew the Torah, like he knew or the Tanakh, I guess, is the old Jewish Bible, the Old Testament parts. He had that knowledge. He quotes it many times over. But he still had that relationship with God. So the book, the letter, was not the end-all be-all. There was more. Do you think for a moment that, like, early Jews looked at the Tanakh, looked at the Torah there, and looked at Paul's letters and said, well, those belong in here? Of course not. Of course not. That's actually the kind of the thing. We all understand that the book of Acts was never finished. We're living it still. Some of us just read about it. So there's an opportunity here for you to actually connect with God in such a way to actually have something more. But before we do that, let's talk about some of the other kind of potential people that this is reaching out to. Probably one of the biggest things that I talk about is, like, atheists. Because you got to understand, like, even whether you believe in God or not, you're on his heart. And you can react with any amount of skepticism or defensiveness, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. It's not my job to change your mind, but it is what I've been given here to provide some context and hopefully an opportunity for you to connect with him. Or at least to give you the keys to be able to, and why you haven't been able to. So the first thing that I need to address is the concept of divine hiddenness. I don't remember the name of the guy who brought it up, but I'd heard it brought up a few different on a few different debates and atheist channels and so on. And it's this idea that God hides himself for those who seek him. But then there are so many atheists who do genuinely seek him. Now there's an argument that, and this is a thing, like, to be fair to you guys, like, Christians make some kind of bad arguments towards you. And that is this, that your hearts are hardened, you don't actually want to know him, you don't actually want a relationship with him, you don't care, yada yada yada. They're all going to point the finger at you in such a way. And understand something very clearly, I'm not going to be totally different in what I'm here to share, but it is different. I'm not going to tell you that, like, it's your fault, but I will tell you that there is a hindrance, and it's an innate one. So it's one you're going to have to kind of, like, surrender. And I have a little bit to kind of illustrate that. See, the trouble with God as a person is that he's not interested in dancing for us. See, a lot of us approach God with this convention, and it's kind of the fault of the church. A lot of church doctrines that most people are familiar with, unfortunately, are kind of transactional. Like, we incidentally paint God in a transactional light. So people will tell you things like, if you seek him, you'll find him. But then you run into this problem of, like, well, I am seeking and he's not showing up. What do I do? And the answer is actually kind of hard to digest. And that is that you can't seek him the way that you are. So I'm just going to say it. The big problem with God is that he's not interested in proving himself to you. Okay? And therein lies kind of the problem that a lot of... Turn that light around a little bit so there's not as much glare off my hand when I'm talking. There. Anyway, there's not as much... How about this? God's not interested in performing for you. Okay? He's not going to prove himself to you. And the crux of the problem for a lot of atheists and people who don't believe in God, and there's a term for it, and it's like a non-resistant person seeking God, a non-resistant atheist, or a non-resistant non-believer. There we go. So there are some people who are resistant believers, and they do have hardened hearts, and they don't want to hear from God. They don't want to know. One thing that I heard quoted was that there was a poll where, like, 80 through one atheist channel, and 85% of atheists who took this poll said that even if God was proven to be real, they wouldn't want to worship him. And that's fine. That's all your choice. But there's still a significant percentage of people who they're what are called non-resistant non-believers, as opposed to these resistant non-believers. See, the problem with it is that the approach to God is that you, on some level, you want him to prove that he's there. But he's not, in his character, God's character, he's not interested in proving himself to you. Okay? It's like, there's actually a line where Jesus kind of illustrates this kind of mentality. Oh, let's see, it's in Matthew 16. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. Jesus replied, "When evening comes, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. You wicked and adulterous generation, or a wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given except the sign of Jonah." Jesus then left them and went away. For context purposes, this comes right on the heels of him healing a bunch of people and performing one of the miracles of, multiplying food. And then as a result, the Pharisees came and they're just like, "Give us a sign that you're the Messiah. Prove it." And Jesus said, "No. You already know how to tell how things work and what they look like. No." And here is kind of the problem. And I know that this kind of flirts with the whole thing of like it's your fault, but let me kind of alleviate that a bit by just kind of expressing my own experience. See, I grew up in the church loosely, but my main focus growing up, the church was more Baptist. Like we grew up in northern Minnesota. Churches were very Baptist, Presbyterian. That's kind of like the bulk of what you run into. There was nothing charismatic happening up there. And the thing about it was that it was very, very sterile. And in the end, my major focus growing up was in the sciences. I was very much so somebody who grew up interested in what I can see, what I can touch, and proof was tantamount. Like you had to prove everything. And I do mean everything. I have a history of being a fairly hard man in that particular regard. If I go back about 10 years and pull up some of the people from then, they'll tell you. Hell, my friend Jeremy is still, a subscriber and whatnot, I think. Anyway, but he could probably just straight tell you how very different I was at the time he met me versus now. I've had a lot of experiences with God since that fateful day back when we were back when we went to youth group together, and he was a witch and I was a former Satanist, and we just became the best of buddies. But anyway, before I became a Satanist, I was very obsessed with science. I wanted to be a zoologist. That was my whole thing. I wanted to study animals. Wanted to study dinosaurs. I wanted to study all these different things. So that's what I grew up on. So proof was a must. Proof was required in all things. The only thing that got me into Satanism was seeing demons and experiencing demons and talking to demons, and that being a thing that was very, very much observable for me. That's what actually led me into Satanism, or started me down that path. I never actually chose that in the sense of saying, well, screw God. It was more a thing of my being kind of I was kind of groomed into it, if that makes sense. That I started doing stuff, and then they started appearing, and I could see them very clearly, and I knew what they were very much. There was no question. And then, suddenly they start telling me things, and I start listening, and I start doing those things, and then lo and behold, fast forward a year later, and I'm summoning demons to go to places with me to harass people, and I'm chasing people away from God, and I'm good at it, and I decide that I'm just going to stick with that because I'm doomed anyways. You know, I figured from the beginning that I was kind of damned. So, you know, all this to say, like, I've had a list of a litany of experiences, and even when I got out of Satanism, that form of Satanism, I I still did not choose God immediately. I instead just kind of chose to drift, looked into other religions, different things like that, and really what got me going to church was a little bit of the fact that I like agreed more with God than anybody else, and a little bit more of the fact that I got kind of suckered into it. So the thing was, though, was for years, even in church, even as somebody who had seen demons and so on, I still wanted God to prove himself to me. You know, I wanted God to prove that he was God. I wanted him to prove that he was real, and I struggled for years as being this kind of like, I went to church, but I didn't have a relationship with God. I read the Bible. I prayed. I did all the things that good Christian boys and girls are supposed to do, allegedly, and to fulfill the requirements of being a Christian. And I tried really hard, and God never met me. You know, like he met me in ways here and there, but he never talked to me. He never showed himself to me. He never came when I called, no matter how much I begged, no matter how much pain I was in, no matter how much I cried, no matter how much of anything. He wouldn't. He just would not. And I felt like I was very heartfelt in that desire. From my perspective, I was doing my best to seek God faithfully, honestly, and try to develop a relationship with him, a real relationship with him. And it didn't work. A key word here is I tried, right? So you, whoever you may be, maybe you don't believe in God. Maybe you're open to the idea, but you want proof. This is where we get to that trying thing. See, I wanted proof too. I wanted him to prove himself to me, and on some level, even in those moments where I really like tried to put that aside, I still couldn't, because I wanted it so bad. It was kind of like a small obsession in a way. And and ultimately, what I hear, especially in the issue of like divine hiddenness, the struggle with atheists in general, with non-believers in general, is the desire for proof. You know, everybody wants God to prove himself, but God isn't interested in proving himself. It's like a complete passing in terms of communication. You know, everybody's kind of stuck in impasse, and God's just like, no, I'm not gonna dance for you. If you come to me, then come to me. But don't expect me to prove myself to you. Don't come demanding that I prove myself to you. And there's a lot more of you who would then want him to explain himself, as though you're the one who's right to judge him over things that you have read about or misunderstood. And I'm going to be blunt for just a second. Most atheists that I've met don't know as much about God as they try to claim they do. And that's not just from the perspective of like knowing the Bible. That's from the perspective of everything. Like the entire convention of who God is just completely off. And it's believed to be justified, and it's not. You know, like... but that's kind of the point here. That's kind of the point. Is that you start kind of falling into this thing of like... bitterly demanding that he one first prove himself and then explain himself. I remember an interview with Stephen Fry where he was asked, you know, what happens if you die and you find yourself standing before God? And Stephen Fry's response was, I would ask him, how dare you? How dare you do all these things? How he went on and gave this very long kind of monologue about how he would respond to the reality of God's presence. And I remember watching it and having been in God's presence before and being like, nah, dude, you're not going to say a word. In your pride right now, you have plenty to say. But in his presence, you don't get pride anymore. So the thing about it is this. Because I don't want this video to go... I feel like it's supposed to be a little shorter. Point blank, God's not going to prove himself to you. But there is a place for you to have the opportunity to know him. And it isn't about prayer or any of those things. Like, I'm not gonna tell you to go read your Bible. It's important, but it's not the main link. Okay? And there are many Christians who disagree with me, and that's cool. They can do that. I've been, you know, I don't need to justify myself in terms of like the relationship that I have and have had with God versus what they might claim to have. The Bible helps, but it's not the end all be all. Relationship with God trumps that. You know, there are people out there who know God and can't read. And they have relationships with God that are very deep, very knowledgeable, very knowing. And there's a reason, and despite that, you know, they're not telling you lines from the Bible. They're telling you things that they know from firsthand experience. And that's ultimately the thing that I would hope to impart to you, is to get to have firsthand experience. Because like I said, this is more of an this is more of an evangelist message. You know, and it's not, I'm not going to like sit here and try to scare you with hell or anything like that. That's not part of this discussion. It might matter a lot to you, and that's fine. Again, it's fine. Maybe you want to like demand that God tell you about hell. Maybe you want to demand to know why he would send you, and that's fine. You're free to demand to know all those things. But it's not going to make him talk to you. Your offense is not going to get you an audience with the God of heaven and earth. You're not justified for it. Your ignorance is not going to cause him to come closer or to perform for you in some way. Because if you think that hell is made for the bad Christians, you don't know as much as you would profess to know. Hell is made for the devil. Hell, the various realms of interplanar holding place that are referred to as hell, you know, Hades, Sheol, are two examples, two rooms, if you would. They were never made for us. They were made as holding places for the devil and those who chose to follow him. By the ability to choose sin, we bought ourselves tickets into that place. By our tendency to align ourselves with demons and with the devil, you know, that's how we ended up having a place in there. Anyway, all that to say, like, it's just going to open up a can of worms to continue on that. And that's fine, like, that can be discussed. I'm more than happy to. But like I said, the intent here is to provide an opportunity to connect to God for real. And the thing about it is that, like, the path to do that, and this goes for anybody who's listening, who's resistant to experiencing, who's either doesn't believe in God at all, or doesn't believe in having a relationship with God that is connected, that is personal. If your personal relationship with God looks like you reading the Bible and praying, that's not actually a personal relationship. Okay? It's not. It's really not. That's not it. That's not what Jesus had. That's not what Moses had. That's not what Paul had. That's not what Abraham had. That's not what Ezekiel or Elijah or Elisha or any of these men of God had. It's not even what David had. So there's more. There's so much more to have. So for both instances, what you're going to need to do, and this is me hopefully handing you the keys to have an experience. You need to get past yourself. Like, you need to take everything that you have, all that need to, like, for God to prove himself, and you need to drop it. And I know that sounds counterproductive and that takes things out of your control, but that's actually kind of the point. To be blunt, if somebody runs up to you demanding that you prove yourself to them, prove that you're good at your job, prove that you are actually knowledgeable about the things that matter to you, prove that you can argue this point about not believing, prove whatever, you're going to take offense to it. Like, some of you might, like, pride in the opportunity to, like, express your knowledge, but if they press you and keep pressing you and deny everything that you're saying, especially out of ignorance, then you're going to get pissed. It's going to aggravate you. And herein lies the perspective that God has towards a lot of this. In every way. He's not going to prove himself to you. So if that's what you're looking for, that's why divine hiddenness is a thing. Is because ultimately, most atheists, the vast majority of atheists, want God to prove himself to them. And it's not just that, but there's also this grand struggle with that deep-seated, like, kind of pridefulness that we know best, that we know. And that has to go too. You know, in the Advent of Light message, we talk about judgment. And we talk about the right to judge, and how judgment is one of those things that can only be truly correct through the lens of the Holy Spirit. Because he has perspective that we don't. Us going off of our own knowledge and perspective, that's going to be a problem. Like, we're gonna lack things, especially when we're looking at God. I've had like atheists, for example, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, I've had atheists in the past, like, argue the point that it was a crime that God wiped out that entire city of people. Why didn't he save them? Well, he actually addresses that in the story. Like, when you read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, he talks to Abraham about that. And the truth of the matter is that Sodom and Gomorrah was in such a state of decay that the moment that two men showed up to collect Lot, the one kind of righteous man in the whole city, the entire male population came out to gang rape them. Like, this isn't acceptable, but more than that, it speaks to the level of defilement that the culture of that city was at. Some would argue that evil is a subjective thing, but in some experiences you'll find evil is not a subjective thing, but rather something that is very real. And in those experiences you find it to be true. You find it to be exactly that. And there isn't a question about whether it is or isn't real. So, the point is this. The point is this. If God's not going to prove himself to you, then what do you do? How do you get past the struggle of what many would refer to as divine hiddenness, or the struggle of determining whether or not God wants to connect with you? And one trick is this. How are you going to toss aside your judgments? How are you going to toss aside your disbelief? How are you going to toss aside your anger at him? How are you going to toss aside all these things? All these things. And the answer, it might surprise you, and that is to suspend your disbelief and reach towards him from a place of humility. See, we had a guy come into our group. I won't name names for his sake, but he might even comment on the video. But he was an atheist, like when he started coming. And the thing that happened with him was that he came, heard the messages, and he did a very interesting thing, and that was that he took his disbelief and he suspended it for the time that he was there. Now, he had the same problem that so many atheists have. And the thing about him was that he was one of the ones who really wanted God to be real, you know? He wanted God to be there. He wanted there to be something. And, you know, he would go to these places where he would sit and he would pray and he would beg and he would pray and he would beg and he would pray. But he didn't recognize his own pride. You know, it was something that we had to talk about on a fairly regular basis, where it was just like, bro, like, this is what you have going on. And, you know, sometimes he was open to that, sometimes he was not open to hearing that, and it's okay, like, that's a journey, you know? But the thing with it is that he started to have stuff happen. And I remember, like, giving him the word where I was just like, you know, it's gonna get weird. Like, the longer that you're around this church group, like, the more that you press in with God, the weirder things are going to get. And, you know, like, the two instances in particular that were the most fun to watch were, there was one where, and I was given the word to tell him, like, be skeptical. Because the thing about it is that God is going to take your skepticism and turn it on itself. Because after a while, after a while as a skeptic, you're going to find situations where you can't just say this is, you know, this is coincidence. Because after a certain amount of time and experience, coincidence stops being coincidental. And so the first thing that happened that was fun to watch was, God gave me a dream about him. And I was explicitly told to, like, draw a picture of what I saw. And it was him with a group of other people in full armor, in full bright shining armor. And, like, he was leading this whole army of people, you know? And they were all similarly armored, but he stood out from in front of the rest of them. And his armor was golden. And he's just kind of, okay, cool, thanks. About a week later, I get a call from him because he's just like, do you know this person? I'm like, I don't know who that is. So a friend of his reached out because she had drawn a picture of him independently of me in any way, shape, or form. I had no idea who this was. I really had no clue that this was going to happen. I just knew what I had for the dream, and I drew the picture. And he gets a picture from this friend who lives in Texas, or lived in Texas, and she had drawn a picture of him in pretty much the same armor, in pretty much the same thing. And she was like, I don't know why, I just felt inspired to draw this. And he's just like, what? And that was fine. That was funny. Well, that wasn't the only story. And he wasn't around for long, like maybe a year. Another big, really funny one was when he, let's see here, he was dating, well, it doesn't matter. And one of the girls from the group gave him a Bible verse. And just to be like fully transparent, our group had a guy that was not, he wasn't like entirely mentally there. And this guy, our atheist guy, he had a significant problem with that. Like, he felt that that was very unjust in the way that some of the other people in the group were treating him. He believed that they were dropping the ball in how they handled him, how they handled this person, the mentally handicapped one. And he was right. He was absolutely 100% right. And there was a night when he came in and he was fully ready. He was going to confront this. And he asked me first, and I'm just like, dude, if you see a problem, say it. And he did. And the funny thing about it was, before he said anything, one of the girls from the group gave him a Bible verse. And he didn't read it. She didn't read it. She just gave it to him. And he brought it all up, and he's in the middle of like arguing with some of the people in the group who were very much so kind of behind the whole thing. Like, they were the ones who were probably they weren't the worst in terms of like how they were treating this person, but one of them was, but the other ones were like not, they were just frustrated because of how difficult it was to try to help this mentally handicapped person. I don't want to be unfair to anybody, but everyone was in the wrong in this, except for our atheist friend. And the funny thing about it is, like, so he is convicted, like, that he is going to address this problem, and he pulls up like, during the conversation, during the fight, he randomly, like, pulls up the verse that he had been given before the whole thing, that nobody read, and he reads it. And it highlights how God, it was something to the effect of, I am with the brokenhearted and the weak. I can't remember the exact verse it was, but it was one of the ones where God is highlighting that he is with the weak and the powerless, and he is there to avenge them, and this whole thing. And he reads it, and it's just like, wait, did you read this before you gave it to me? And she's like, I didn't read anything, man. I just gave it to you because God gave it to me to share with you. And he's just like, so wait, is that God telling me that he's on my side about this? And I'm just like, yeah, man. Yeah, God's got your back. And he's just like, what? Which fit with one of the most important things to him, because one of his big frustrations with one of the big hindrances with him believing in God was that he didn't believe God had his back. Here he was, fighting with 5 Christians in a room about how they treated a handicapped person, and God had his back. down to the point of places where it maybe could not have been. So I say all this to highlight this point that this guy, he suspended his disbelief. He took it, he put it aside, and he just chose to come with an open heart. And that's kind of the thing here. In the Bible, there's a story about a king named Ahab. He was the husband of Jezebel. Um, if you don't know the story, then you've probably heard the term Jezebel, at least. But the thing about it is that Ahab basically sold out all of Israel to worship the idols of that Jezebel brought with her. And in the story, like, he sold Israel out. He did the things. And there's a point where God tells him he's going to die. So Ahab just throws down and humbles himself before God. And God just sits there. He tells the prophet who was meant to, like, deliver the message, he's like, have you seen this? Have you seen how he's humbled himself? Go back and tell him it's not going to go down quite like I told him. It's still going to happen, but it's not going to be as bad. And it's just one of those things where it's like his heart is changed even for people who have made themselves his enemies. And just to be clear, like, if you don't know him personally, if you don't have, like, a strong relationship with him, you can't really hurt him. Because you don't know him. Which means all of your anger, all of your bluster, and even in these places where you might have, like, decided that you are an enemy of God, or maybe you have actively tried to be an enemy of God, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't stop you from being able to connect to him. It doesn't stop you from being able to find a relationship with him. It's like a child throwing a temper tantrum at the daycare. And I know that that could sound demeaning. It's not intended to. Rather, it's an assertion about, like, the way that he perceives our behavior. You don't send a kid to jail for throwing a temper tantrum. That's my point. Anyway, we've gotten a lot longer than I had intended. So here's the thing. We'll just try to make this quick. Take your judgments and your disbelief. Toss them aside for a moment. And let's try to get to a place where we can actually connect to God. Have a real, actual connection with him. Maybe for the first time. And maybe this is the time when you finally see that he's real. Or maybe it's not. And I know that maybe you don't want to. And of all the things that I've said, if, like, you're the kind of person where you deem your offense with God more valuable, then fine. Video's done for you. If you do want to connect with God, though, and if maybe there's a part of you that really wants to know him, like, it's not just a thing of, like, you want him to prove himself, because that's going to have to go no matter what. Before you can connect to him, you're going to have to push aside the points of him needing to prove himself to you. Because the reason why he's not going to prove himself to you is because you're demanding that he prove himself to you. You are demanding that the God of heaven and earth come down and prove to you specifically, that he is worthy of you. And that's not gonna happen. Because you are not that big of a deal. You are not so important or so invaluable to the grandiosity of life that God is going to diminish himself to feed your pride. Okay? But he will come to somebody who is humble-hearted. And I know that there are many who do seek truth with humility, but there's still that part where you're wanting to prove himself before you'll believe. So let's take that and brush that aside for a moment. Let's pretend for a moment that God is very real and that he wants you to know him. How do you think you do that? How do you think you connect? Well, we pray, right? But it's a specific kind of prayer. We say, when we've taken all of that and brushed it aside, and if you need time, pause the video, do that. Take a moment to set yourself in a posture, in a mental posture, an emotional posture of get relaxed. Take what you feel, any offense, any disbelief, and just brush it aside. And let's imagine that God is real. Let's imagine that he is actually very real, and you know this. Imagine that he's good. Imagine that he is in fact good. Now with that, I should pause. Now imagine that he wants you to go to heaven, that he wants you forever, like he wants to live with you forever. And whatever you think of heaven, just brush that aside too. I'm not gonna spend another 30 minutes discussing heaven and what that looks like and how different that is from lions and lambs. We're not making macaroni pictures or anything like that. Thank you, South Park. Take it all and put it aside for a moment. And let's just say that heaven is a place that's with him. It's a place where he keeps you and he loves you. Let's just leave it there. So let's take all that stuff, all those judgments, and push them aside and just come saying to ourselves, I want to meet God. I want to meet God for real. I know he's there. I know that he loves me. And then this. If you can take your pride and set it aside, if you can take your need for him to prove himself and take it aside, then approach him with this. Holy Spirit, would you come now and meet me? Jesus, I want to know you. I want to know you inside and out. I want to know you in every way. Come and meet me. I humble myself before you. I know that I am yours. I know that I am not the most important person in the room right now because you're in this room. I humble myself before you. I surrender anything and everything that stands between us. I lay that down before you too. And I'll ask your forgiveness of any sin that you throw at any sin that you see. Just come and meet me. Come and meet me, Lord. I will be yours. I want you to be mine. Jesus. Jesus. No. No, with all that said, if nothing happened, then that's fine. It is hard to like get past that thing. I know. I've experienced it. I spent years demanding that God prove himself to me. But before that, if something happened and you like felt something, pull into it. You wanted to know, you wanted a relationship with God. Now is your opportunity. Experience it. Find it, enjoy it to its fullest, and get to know him. And press in. Press in. And stop this video. Like, kill it. Just spend your time with him. If on the other hand nothing happened, you felt nothing, don't sit back and like be like, another one. No. Come back to it. Check your heart. See if you truly have like put aside the need for him to prove yourself, or for him to prove himself, or if you're like quietly hoping that he will, or if you're quietly wanting him to. And I know those aren't like the same, but they kind of are, because they're coming from the same place. We can't just press for him to prove himself all the time. It's not going to happen. What we can press for is to try to get to places where we can meet him, and he'll be willing to meet us, and there's not a competition about it. In the end, surrender is the most important thing. I know, like, culturally, we don't love words like submission and surrender. You know, we tend to conflate them with concepts like subjugation. But all it is to say, look, man, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have this. I'm open to possibilities. It's okay. It's okay to be in that place, to not know. A lot of agnostics out there who don't know, profess to don't know. That's all okay. In the end, the hope is that this video will help, and I'm sure that there's enough in here that's inflammatory that I could get like a lot of people after me, and I was really hoping to keep it half the length that it is. But I felt like there was a lot that had to be kind of like said and addressed. Anyway, if you want to just go back to the last 10 minutes, 15 minutes of this, I just go back over that again and again. That might help. But there's also just a place of like surrendering that need for him to prove himself. It's funny, it seems backwards, but that's kind of God's nature. He's not interested in like in stroking the egos and the knowledge of the wise. You know, he's more interested in establishing his own kingdom, his own way. And he gets us in a lot of ways that we don't. Anyway, that's what I got.